Good evening and welcome to the 2000 Cool Lectures. I'm James Hudnut-Beumler, Dean of the Vanderbilt Divinity School. I welcome you all. This Coal Lectureship was established in 1893 by Colonel E.W. Cole of Nashville. And since that time, it has brought distinguished lecturers to the campus in service of its original purpose, quote, defense and advocacy of the Christian religion, unquote. Tonight's lecturer, Marcus J. Borg, is Hundair Distinguished Professor of Religion and Culture in the Philosophy Department of Oregon State University. Nationally and internationally known in both academic and church circles as a Jesus scholar, Dr. Borg is the author of 10 books, including the best-selling Jesus, A New Vision of 1987, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time of 1994. His most recent books are Jesus in Contemporary Scholarship, 1994, Jesus at 2000, 1996, The God We Never Knew of 1997, and The Meaning of Jesus, Two Visions, 1999. We are indeed pleased and honored to have such a prolific scholar with us for this year's Cole Lectures. Dr. Borg is described by the New York Times as a leading figure among the new generation of Jesus scholars. He's also appeared on NBC's Today Show, PBS's NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, Peter Jennings' Prime Time on ABC, and NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross. He's a regular columnist for BeliefNet. He's a fellow of the Jesus Seminar and has been national chair of the Historical Jesus section of the Society of Biblical Literature and co-chair of its International New Testament Program Committee. He is currently president of the Anglican Association of Biblical Scholars, and his work has been translated into German, Dutch, Korean, Japanese, Italian, Spanish, and French. His doctoral degree is from Oxford University, and he's lectured in a variety of countries overseas, including England, Scotland, Austria, Germany, Belgium, Hungary, Israel, and South Africa. So much for the official things that you must know about our Cole lecturer. I wish to add a word to indicate how Marcus Borg is a quintessentially appropriate fit for a lectureship that is designed to offer defense and advocacy of the Christian religion. For behind all the achievements that I have just narrated, the Marcus Borg I know is best at one thing, helping us to see what was before us and who was among us all the time, though we saw it not. Indeed, reversing one of Jesus' own metaphors, it seems to me that the singular gift of Marcus Borg is to put old wine in new wineskins, to allow us to see Jesus in new and compelling ways. And what better advocacy and defense of the Christian religion could there be? And speaking of wine, we're pleased to invite you all, colleagues, students, friends, clergy, alumni, people from the town, readers of the Tennessean, to a reception following Dr. Borg's lecture located behind me and over a bit, accessible through the back door or around the Divinity Quadrangle through the rest of the building, to a reception, as I say, located in Tillett Faculty Lounge, which is immediately behind me, and to which all of you are welcome this evening. Tomorrow morning, back in the same place, we will hear the second lecture at 10 a.m. Welcome, Dr. Borg.
Well, good evening. The microphone sounds fine to me. Anybody in the back want us to play with it? Stick up a hand if you do. You either can't hear a word I'm saying or it's just fine, so I'll proceed. I want to start off this evening by thanking your new dean, James Hudnut-Beumler, for that introduction, as well as for being my primary host for this event. And I also want to acknowledge Trudy Springer, who has been my primary email partner over the last few months, arranging final details for this event. And I also want to thank all of you for being here. This is one of my favorite things to do, talking to large groups of people about what I do as a scholar and its meaning for the life of the church, and I would feel very silly doing this all by myself, so I appreciate your being here. I want to take a couple of minutes to find out something about you as a group, and so I'm going to ask you a few questions to which the appropriate response is a raising of hands, and I'll make quick estimates as to what percentages or numbers that I see. And let me start off by asking, how many of you are Vanderbilt students? Okay, I'm going to guess I'm seeing about 30 hands. That's not a percentage, but a raw number, okay? How many of you are alumni of the Divinity School? Okay, I would say maybe 35, a few more than there are students here. How many of you, and I ask this not to establish a pecking order, because in fact I don't belong at the top of this pecking order, how many of you are clergy? Okay, I'm going to guess that's about 25% or so, at least 20%. And then let me quickly do a little bit of a denominational check-in, because I'm always interested in that. And I'll mention up front that one of your choices will be that category that Jack Spong has taught us to use, the Church Alumni Association. Okay, and it's a significant category in our culture. Let me start off, because of geography and maybe historic affiliation, I'm less sure about that, by asking how many of you are Methodists? Okay, I'm going to guess that's a third to 40%, maybe something like that. Presbyterians? Oh, okay, we've got more than I expected. It looks like I don't know, 15%, something like that. Good, good. Disciples of Christ, the Christian Church. Okay, I'll start. We've got maybe 15, not percent, but raw numbers now. United Church of Christ. Oh, welcome. Sometimes in the South you folks don't show up. Okay, about 18 or 20 of you. Roman Catholics. Okay, we have maybe 10. Welcome, welcome. Baptists. Oh, good, good. We've got about a dozen Baptists. I know there's a great variety in the Baptist tradition, but I also will say that Baptists are typically not my biggest fans, so I'm glad to have you here tonight. Unitarian Universalists? Oh, good, good. We've got a dozen or so of you folks. Quakers? Any Quakers here? One, at least. Mennonites? Okay, Mennonite, okay. Lutherans. I can put up half a hand for that one. I grew up Lutheran. We got 4.5 Lutherans, I think. And Episcopalians, my own tradition. Oh, all right. Maybe we've got 20 Episcopalians here. And let's see, people from the Jewish tradition. Okay, welcome, at least one. Buddhists. Okay, we've got at least one, good. Muslims. Okay, at least one. I don't make a list before I do this. I'm always afraid I'll forget somebody of major importance. So is there a denomination I haven't called out you'd like to check? Oh, I should do Church Alumni Association first. Church Alumni Association? Okay, we have half a dozen or so from the Church Alumni Association. Good. Any other denominations you want to call out to check? Yeah. Okay, good. Non-denominational Christian. It's a growing group in our country. Non-denominational Christians, couple. Okay, good. Pentecostal. Pentecostals? I was going to say just wave your hands, but okay. Well, two more questions and then we'll be underway here. I'm curious, this will sound like a professor checking up on you to see if you've done your homework, but it's not that kind of question. How many of you have read at least one of my books on Jesus? It's helpful for me to know that. Okay, it looks like, I don't know, 3/4 of you maybe? And then, how many of you have heard me before in person? Okay, about a dozen. I might risk using an old joke or two then, but I'll try not to belabor that. Quick comment about our time frame. We have until 8:15 tonight. I hope to talk for about 45 minutes once I get going, which will leave us 15 minutes or so for Q&A. And in order to keep myself honest, I use an electronic digital timer up here. When I introduced my timer some 7 years or so ago in Seattle, I made the remark to the audience that they might find me slightly anal retentive with regard to time. And during the coffee break, a man came up to me with his notepad in one hand and his pen in the other hand, and with what looked to me like a rather anxious look on his face, he asked me, "Does anal retentive have a hyphen?" When I told that story in Richmond a few years ago now, somebody from the audience called out, "No, but it should have a colon." So. So let me move to tonight's talk then. And I need to start off by saying that the order of my presentations will be the opposite of what it says in the Cole Lectures brochure. Initially it was set up so that tonight I would talk about the legacy of Schweitzer, tomorrow about the battle for Jesus today, and then last April or so the chair of the Schweitzer committee got in touch with me and asked if we could reverse the order so the Schweitzer lecture would be tomorrow morning, and we worked that out with the Divinity School, and so the order will be tonight the battle for Jesus today, and tomorrow morning, Jesus today, the legacy of Schweitzer. And I apologize if any of you had really been hoping to see the Schweitzer or hear the Schweitzer lecture tonight and won't be able to tomorrow morning, but it's beyond my control at this point. So let me introduce what I'm going to talk about tonight by noting that there's a remarkable amount of interest in the historical study of Jesus and Christian origins in our time. Within the academy itself, there's been a renaissance in Jesus scholarship over the last 15 to 20 years. But even more striking than that is the remarkable public attention that the historical study of Jesus has attracted. The evidence for that is widespread. A couple of quick indications. In the decade of the 1990s, 7 different books by Jesus scholars made Publishers Weekly 10 best-selling list in religion. And that's a list for which all books in religion are eligible. Books by the Pope, by Billy Graham, by Mother Teresa, the chicken soup books that until recently were crowding the list. And for 7 books by Jesus scholars to make that list is remarkable. Or another example, each of the major news weekly magazines has run several cover stories each on historical Jesus scholarship during the 1990s. And at Easter 1996, all 3 of the major news weeklies had as their cover story not simply Jesus, but historical Jesus scholarship. Or one other example, the number of television specials on the quest for the historical Jesus. Public television has done a 4-hour series. The A&E channel has done, I think, an even longer series. Peter Jennings Primetime did a 2-hour show this last June. There is this remarkable public appetite for the historical study of Jesus and Christian origins. And that's a very interesting fact about our time. And I'll return to that at the end of my talk. For now, I want to note that it has also been controversial, and much of that controversy has been in response to the work of the Jesus Seminar, a group of scholars with whom I was involved for about 10 years. This is the group of scholars that met twice a year to examine all of the words and deeds attributed to Jesus one by one, to discuss them, debate them, and then vote on which of these we think went back to Jesus, which of these are the product of the early community. And within the scholarly world, there's nothing very remarkable about that in a way. We're just measuring the degree of scholarly consensus about how much goes back to Jesus. But in some circles, this has churned up a real ruckus. Time magazine, for example, in that Easter 1996 issue, referred to the Jesus Seminar as follows, and I think this is a direct quote or a very close paraphrase. Rebel scholars of a self-appointed Bible tribunal from the liberal fringes of scholarship determined to destroy traditional Christianity at any cost. And when I finished reading that, I thought to myself, now, am I being paranoid, or is there an edge in that? And that leads me then to a roadmap of my talk tonight. I'm going to talk about the battle over Jesus today, and I will do so in 3 parts. In part 1, I'll speak about the battle over Jesus within the church. In part 2, the battle over Jesus within the academy. And then in part 3, some remarks about why all of this matters. So let me turn to part 1. The battle within the church. The battle within the church is really a conflict between 2 ways of seeing Christianity. Virtually a tale of 2 Christianities. And I think the church in North America is deeply divided today between these 2 ways of seeing Christianity. And this battle is ultimately over 2 things. And the first is, it's a conflict between 2 very different ways of seeing the Bible. An older, conventional, and very widespread way of seeing the Bible, at least amongst Protestants, is to see it as, in some important sense, a divine product coming from God as no other book does. And therefore, as a divine product, it has a divine guarantee to be truthful and to be accurate. And for some Christians, especially for our fundamentalist and conservative Christian brothers and sisters, this leads to affirmations of the Bible's infallibility or inerrancy. And obviously the quest for the historical Jesus really threatens that, for the whole quest has as its premise that the Gospels are a developing tradition containing both history and metaphor, and that they reflect the convictions of early Christian communities near the end of the 1st century, rather than being straightforward historical reports about Jesus himself. And the other way of seeing the Bible is one that is gradually emerging within the mainline church. It's not new within the world of theology, but this other way of seeing the Bible in general sees it as a human product, as the product of 2 ancient communities, the Hebrew Bible being the product of ancient Israel, the Christian Testament being the product of the early Christian movement. It also affirms that the Bible is a response to the experience of God, so it doesn't get rid of God completely, but it says this is a human witness to the experience of God. And it sees the Bible as a combination of history and metaphor. Now, because the quest for the historical Jesus has such high public visibility, it has become a lightning rod for that broader question of the nature of the Bible and its authority. So that's the first dimension of the battle over Jesus within the church. The second dimension of the battle over Jesus within the church is that it's a conflict between two ways of seeing the Christian life, of what being a Christian is about. Two images of the Christian life, and these two images of the Christian life are associated with two quite different images of Jesus. An older conventional image of the Christian life was grounded in this older conventional image of Jesus. It's a very familiar image of Jesus. It is one that many of us grew up with, not simply those of us who grew up in very conservative churches, but people of my generation and older, and some younger, growing up in mainline denominations, would have formed this image as a child. It's the image we get from taking the Gospels quite literally or semi-literally as historical reporting, as reporting historically factual events. And it has four major elements, which I will very quickly name. The first concerns the identity of Jesus, that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God, and knew himself to be such and proclaimed himself to be such, that this was part of the self-consciousness of Jesus. The second element concerns his death, that his death was salvific, meaning his death had saving significance, and he himself saw it this way. He saw his death as, in some important sense, the purpose of his life. And the third element in this older conventional understanding of Jesus concerns Easter, that Easter meant that Jesus was raised physically and bodily from the dead so that the tomb was really empty. And the fourth element that I'll mention in this older conventional image of Jesus is that he is the only way of salvation. After all, there is a saying attributed to Jesus, most of us know it by heart, John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to God but by me. Now there's an image of the Christian life that goes with this older image of Jesus. This image of the Christian life emphasizes believing that Jesus was who he said he was, and that he died for our sins. And let me note in passing that this emphasis upon believing as central to the Christian life is very modern. It's a post-Enlightenment development since the 17th and 18th centuries. For just a moment, try to get your mind back to the Christian Middle Ages. It didn't take faith to believe any of these things about Jesus. This was simply the conventional wisdom of the time that everybody took for granted. Christian faith meant something very different from believing these things, because these things were taken for granted. I also want to note in passing how odd it is that we should think being a Christian is primarily about believing. Believing, when you think about it, is relatively impotent, relatively powerless. You can believe all the right things and still be miserable, still be in bondage, still be untransformed. And it's also very odd that we should think that we are saved by our beliefs, as if what God is most concerned about is that we get our beliefs right. But in any case, because the Enlightenment called traditional Christian teachings into question, believing has come to be emphasized in the modern period, and an emphasis upon believing typically goes with this older conventional image of Jesus. Secondly, this older image of Jesus tends to go with an image of the Christian life that is centered on sin, guilt, and forgiveness. And that's because of the central significance given to the saving death of Jesus. And again, when one thinks about it, it's really quite remarkable how central sin, guilt, and forgiveness are to the Christian life. It's part of virtually every mainline denomination's Sunday morning liturgy. It includes a confession of sins and an absolution. I don't want to be misunderstood here. I have no illusions that any of us are perfect. I understand Methodists try. So I'm not saying we are not capable of doing terrible things to each other and so forth, but this preoccupation with sin and guilt is quite remarkable. And I was really struck by this a few summers ago in a liberal Christian institution where I was for a week. And every day began with a chapel service at 9 o'clock. This is a liberal Christian institution. And each chapel service began with a confession of sin. And I thought to myself, it's 9 o'clock in the morning and we've already been bad. But this older image of Jesus tends to generate that. And third and finally, this older image of the Christian life that goes with this older image of Jesus tends to emphasize the afterlife, that this is the bottom line of what it means to be a Christian. Now, the historical study of Jesus and Christian origins calls this image of Jesus into question. It's not just me, or not just the Jesus Seminar, but the majority, the strong majority of mainline gospel and Jesus scholars are very skeptical that Jesus thought of himself as the Son of God or as the Messiah. We see that language as post-Easter language emerging within the early Christian community to speak about the significance of Jesus. The majority of us do not think that Jesus saw his own purpose as dying for the sins of the world or whatever. We see his death as the consequence of what he was up to, and the interpretation of his death as, amongst other things, a sacrifice for sins, as a retrospective, post-Easter attempt to give providential meaning to the death of Jesus. And we don't think he said, John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to God but by me. And we don't think the truth of Easter is tied up with whether or not the tomb was empty. We think the truth of Easter is grounded in the ongoing experience of Jesus as a figure of the present, as a living reality to this very day. And if we still experience Jesus today, then whether or not the tomb was empty becomes rather irrelevant, possibly even a distracting kind of question. And this also leads to a different image of the Christian life. The Christian life is no longer primarily about believing certain things about Jesus, believing that he was the Son of God, that he died for the sins of the world, etc. But the Christian life is about taking seriously what Jesus took seriously. The Christian life is about seeing in Jesus the decisive disclosure or revelation of what a life full of God is like, and then following Jesus on the path of discipleship that involves opening ourselves to the reality of the Spirit and becoming more and more compassionate beings. So that's what's at stake in the battle within the church. I turn now to part 2, the controversy or the battle within the academy. Here also the conflict is about 2 questions or 2 matters. One is the historical question of what Jesus was like as a figure of history. The other is the theological question of, does it matter? And I will treat those 2 questions in turn. So let me begin with the historical question, what was Jesus like? And I'm going to develop this with two subpoints. In 2 minutes or less, I'm going to crystallize my own 5-stroke understanding of the historical Jesus, just so that's out in front of you. And then at a slightly slower pace, I'm going to talk about some of the diversity within the discipline about the question of what Jesus was like. So, a reminder of my own 5-stroke sketch of the historical Jesus. The first stroke is that I am persuaded historically that he was a Jewish mystic. A mystic is a person who has vivid and frequent experiences of God, and I see Jesus as one who had such experiences, and I think this was the foundation of everything else that he was, and including the foundation of the other 4 strokes, which I now do even more rapidly. Secondly, I think he was a healer and an exorcist. I think he must have been a remarkable one. More healing stories are told about him than about any other person in the Jewish tradition. Third, I think he was a wisdom teacher, a teacher of an alternative wisdom grounded in his mystical experience of God. Fourth, I think he was a social prophet, like the great social prophets of the Hebrew Bible, people who were passionate about systemic justice in the name of God, God-intoxicated voices of religious social protest. And fifth and finally, I think Jesus was a movement founder, namely the founder of a movement whose purpose was the revitalization of Judaism in his day. So having laid out my own understanding that quickly, let me now turn to talking about some of the diversity within the discipline itself regarding the question of what he was like. And I'm going to do this by talking about 5 spectrums, okay? And I will tell you what's at the end of each spectrum as I do so and line up a few scholars in relationship to different points on the spectrum. I'm not going to take time to explain who these scholars were, so if you get lost during this period, don't worry. In about 4 minutes it'll be over with, okay? But just because of time, I'm not going to explain the scholars, but just name them. Okay, the first spectrum is apocalyptic eschatology. I'm going to say more about this tomorrow when I talk about Schweitzer, but apocalyptic eschatology basically means did Jesus expect the dramatic supernatural intervention of God in the very near future? Okay. One end of the spectrum is apocalyptic. Yes, he did. The other end of the spectrum is non-apocalyptic. No, he didn't. At the apocalyptic end of the spectrum, Ed Sanders from Duke belongs. John Meyer, the moderate Roman Catholic scholar, belongs here. Paula Fredrickson, one of Ed Sanders' students, now a scholar in her own right, also belongs here. My colleague from England, N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, he saves the apocalyptic language. So he thinks Jesus used the language of apocalyptic. But when you pay attention to what Tom does with that, it's clear that Tom doesn't think that Jesus expected God dramatically to intervene and intervene in the near future and send the everlasting kingdom. He gives a non-apocalyptic reading to apocalyptic language, really. At the non-apocalyptic end of the spectrum would be Burton Mack with his portrait of Jesus as a Hellenistic type cynic sage, Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar, John Dominic Crossan. I would belong at this end of the spectrum too. The Jesus Seminar in general belongs there, and I think Richard Horsley belongs there. And I ultimately think Tom Wright belongs there. Second spectrum. How much is historical? How much of what is reported in the Gospels can be treated as accurate information about Jesus? And here the spectrum ranges from maximalist, meaning a whole lot of it, to minimalist, not very much at all being historical. Amongst mainline scholars, fundamentalist scholars would all be at the maximalist end, okay? But amongst mainline scholars, Ben Witherington would belong underneath the far end of the maximalist position. Tom Wright would be not far removed from that. In the middle would be John Meyer, the moderate Roman Catholic scholar I mentioned. I think Dom Crossan belongs there in the middle. I would put myself in the middle. Of course, that's where one would want to be on something like this. Walter Wink, I think, belongs in the middle. Elizabeth Schistler Fiorenza, I think, is near the middle. And again, Richard Horsley is near the middle. At the minimalist end of the spectrum, not very much being historical, would be Burton Mack, Robert Funk. And I actually think I would put Ed Sanders toward that minimalist end, because really he's got Jesus as a prophet of restoration eschatology, but not much else gets taken into account in Ed's portrait. Third spectrum. The name of the spectrum is an interdisciplinary approach to the study of Jesus. This is one of the new developments in biblical scholarship generally, Jesus scholarship also. By this I mean the use of models and insights drawn from cultural anthropology, sociology of new religious movements, medical anthropology, the history of political economy, studies of honor-shame societies, purity societies, and so forth. Those are just all for instances of what I mean by an interdisciplinary approach. At one end of the spectrum is not much use of that. At the other end of the spectrum would be a lot. Okay? At the not much use of that end of the spectrum would again, I think, be Ed Sanders, Paula Fredrickson, Tom Wright, John Meyer. At the other end of the spectrum, a lot of use of that would be Dom Crossan, who does this, I think, better than anybody. I would put myself in that a lot category as well. Richard Horsley belongs there, and Elizabeth Schistler Fiorenza. Two more spectra to go. Okay? Fourth spectrum is politics. How political was Jesus, or to what extent was Jesus a social prophet like the great social prophets of the Hebrew Bible? At one end of the spectrum, apolitical, meaning not very political at all. The other end, of course, being significantly political. Okay? At the apolitical end of the spectrum, Ed Sanders, John Meyer, Bob Funk, Burton Mack, for very different reasons, and Paula Fredrickson. At the political end of the spectrum, meaning that's a big component of what we see in Jesus, I would put myself there, Walter Wink, Dom Crossan, Richard Horsley, and once again Elizabeth Schistler Fiorenza. And then the fifth and final spectrum that I'll name is emphasis upon religious experience. That is, how much is that emphasized in various scholars' work? Or you could call this spectrum Jesus and the Spirit, or Jesus as a Jewish mystic. At the not much end of the spectrum is almost everybody. I'll qualify that in a moment, okay? At the a lot of emphasis end of the spectrum would be the Jewish scholar Geza Vermesh with his understanding of Jesus as a Galilean charismatic Jew. Stephen Davies with his understanding of Jesus as somebody who regularly went into trance states in order to heal and so forth. The British scholar James Dunn, his work on Jesus and the Spirit is really, really good, and of course I would belong at that end of the spectrum as well. Now, the qualifying remark I want to make is that it's not clear to me that everybody else belongs at the not much importance end. It's just that other scholars really don't talk about this. And I need to start asking them why. I don't know why it hasn't occurred to me to do that. Maybe I don't want to know. But I mean, I can imagine that they don't talk about this because they think it's so obvious that you don't need to mention it. Or they think it is so unlikely that it doesn't need to be talked about, or they don't know what to make of paranormal experiences of the Spirit. And it might be a mixture of all three of those, conceivably. So that's the first part of what I want to say about the question within the discipline, that diversity of opinion about what he was like. The second issue within the discipline is the theological question. Not just the historical question, but the theological question, does the historical study of Jesus matter for theology and the church? And there's been a tendency throughout much of the 20th century to set that up as a radical either-or question. That either the historical Jesus matters or the Christ of faith, the biblical Christ, matters. And the question was first set up that way in a book published in 1895 by Martin Kahler. The English title, it's a German book, but translated into English, the title speaks of the so-called historical Jesus versus the actual biblical Christ. And Kahler's point was that the actual biblical Christ is the Christ of faith, the Christ we meet in the Gospels. The historical reconstruction of Jesus has no significance for the life of the church. And exactly 100 years later, the best-known mainline scholar to adopt this position wrote a book called The Real Jesus. Luke Timothy Johnson of Candler School of Theology at Emory University is the author. And the subtitle of Luke Johnson's book tells us quite a bit about his point of view. The main title, again, is The Real Jesus. The subtitle is The Misguided Quest for the Historical Jesus and the Truth of the Traditional Gospels. Now, what makes Johnson's book important is that he's a mainline scholar voicing these criticisms. This is the kind of thing one might expect to hear from a trenchantly conservative evangelical scholar or even a fundamentalist scholar. But Johnson is a mainline scholar, and he's very good. He's very, very good. And his charge against those of us doing historical Jesus scholarship is twofold. His first charge is we're doing it badly. And here Johnson's book is a rather scurrilous diatribe against those of us active in the field. You would expect me to view it as unfair. I won't say anything more about that, except that when Luke talks about the historical Jesus, he turns nasty. But anyway, that set of issues is reasonably easily dealt with. You can make cases about, yeah, this is being done well or whatever. It's the second charge he makes that seems to me to be the more important one. And his second charge is that the historical study of Jesus is theologically irrelevant. That it's a mistake to spend time on this enterprise if your purpose in doing so is to think about the significance for Christians and so forth. And Johnson's insistent point is that only the living Jesus matters, only the real Jesus matters, and the real Jesus for Johnson is the living Jesus of Christian experience, as well as the canonical Jesus being the Jesus we meet on the surface level of the Gospels and the New Testament. That figure is the real Jesus. Now, I see Johnson as mounting an attack on what Houston Smith has called fact fundamentalism, which is a very useful phrase. Fact fundamentalism is that modern notion that truth and factuality are identical and that therefore only the factual matters. And some historical Jesus scholarship has been driven by that conviction that if Jesus didn't say it, it doesn't matter. If Jesus didn't do it, it doesn't matter. You might as well cut it out of the New Testament. That's fact fundamentalism. Only if it's factual does it matter. And I agree completely with Johnson's attack on fact fundamentalism. And it's interesting to me that both biblical literalists and some biblical liberals are fact fundamentalists. Biblical literalists are fact fundamentalists because they insist that in order for the Genesis stories of creation to be true, they have to be factual, and so they'll defend the factual happening of those stories We liberals have sometimes made the mistake of thinking we can rescue a few facts from the fire, but both fundamentalists and liberals have sometimes agreed on fact fundamentalism. Johnson, I think, though he doesn't use that phrase, is utterly correct to attack that. The metaphorical, the symbolic, the non-historical can be deeply meaningful and deeply important. Where I disagree with Johnson is not in his affirmation of the canonical Jesus and the living Jesus. I agree with everything he says about that. Where I disagree with Johnson is in his negation of the usefulness of the historical study of Jesus and Christian origins. I think that matters, and so I turn now to part 3, which also leads to my conclusion. Why the historical study of Jesus and Christian origins matters. And here I'm going to develop primarily 2 reasons. The first reason is theological, but with a very practical and immediate consequence. Let me begin by putting the point negatively and then elaborate it a bit. Put negatively, the point goes like this. Without the historical study of Jesus, we risk losing the radical social, political vision of Jesus, and for that matter, of Moses and the prophets. Let me explain what I mean by returning to Johnson's work for a moment. Johnson argues that, as I've mentioned, the quest for the historical Jesus is a mistake, and he says that we can instead discern a consistent pattern to the life of Jesus in the pages of the New Testament without excavating the text, without trying to go beneath the text. He says if we look at the Gospels, if we look at the letters of Paul and so forth, a consistent overall pattern or gestalt of what Jesus was like emerges. He calls it a messianic pattern sometime. And he repeats this pattern a number of times with slightly different phraseology. Let me provide you with a crystallization of Johnson's answer to the question, who was Jesus? And I'll do it with 2 sentences. They're both close paraphrases of what he's saying. And they say very much the same thing. Jesus was one who, in radical obedience to God, gave his life in loving service of others. Jesus was one who, in radical obedience to God, gave his life in loving service of others. And then he speaks, the same point, of the messianic pattern of, quote, radical obedience to God and selfless love toward other people, end of quote. This is what he thinks we can say about what the life of Jesus was like, because it is this constant pattern in the New Testament. And he says we are called to emulate that. Now, that's an altogether admirable ethical pattern. And like many of you, I imagine, would that we had more people like that is a strong desire. But what's missing from it? Well, what's missing from it is precisely the political and the passion for social justice. To be specific, Johnson's crystallization of what Jesus was like without doing historical reconstruction ignores that Jesus didn't simply give his life. That would fit Mother Teresa and many of the saints, and again, Lord knows, it'd be wonderful to have more people like that, so there's no criticism of them at all in what I'm going to say. But Johnson's summary of the messianic pattern we see in Jesus ignores that Jesus didn't simply give his life, but he was killed. And he was killed because he was a social prophet who challenged the domination system. We lose track of that if we retroject the language of Jesus offering up his life out of loving service to others, or Jesus offering up his life for the sins of the world. If we retroject that into the history of Jesus, we lose track of what it was, in fact, that Jesus was willing to get killed for. He was willing to get killed because of his passion for social justice, because of his radical critique of the domination system, because he stood for the kingdom of God and against the domination systems of this world. To make that point yet one other way, it has struck me only recently. I mean, this is something that all of us who grew up in the church should have known since we were old enough to know anything. But it has struck me only recently that we as Christians live within the only major religion in the world whose founder was executed by established authority. We live in the only major religious tradition in the world whose founder was executed by established authority. I don't say that to establish that somehow Christianity is better than the other religions. It's just different. And whenever we talk about Jesus and lose track of that fact, we commit a political domestication of Christianity that easily turns Christianity into either an individualized and privatized religion that is no threat to anybody, or into a legitimator of whatever domination system the religion happens to be living within. And we betray exactly that which Jesus was willing to give his life for by being killed. Put positively, the historical study of Jesus helps us to recover the alternative social vision of Jesus. It is one that stands in continuity with Moses and the prophets, who are the other major formative voices within the biblical tradition. It is the originating vision of the great figures of the biblical tradition. It is a vision that combines religion and politics, that combines spirituality, compassion, and a passion for social justice in the world. And without the historical study of Jesus, we risk losing track of that. The second reason why the historical study of Jesus matters, and this will also lead very quickly to my conclusion, the second reason is pastoral, if you will. And by that I mean simply that the historical approach to Jesus and Christian origins, and by extension to the Bible as a whole, is providing many people with a way back into wholehearted involvement in the life of the church. Earlier I talked about those bestsellers. Most of the people buying those books are mainline Christians. They're not being bought by skeptics who are looking for justification for having left the church. They're bought and devoured by mainline Christians who can no longer be literalists, and who are looking for a way of reading and hearing the Gospels and the Bible that makes compelling and persuasive sense to them. That we can argue, to use the old cliche, until the cows come home about whether or not the historical study of Jesus matters theologically. The fact is, it is mattering practically for at least single-digit millions of people in our culture, and maybe even low double-digit millions of people in our culture. And this is happening at the grassroots level of mainline denominations. The majority of people reading these books are lay people. And one of the interesting things that is happening is that some of those lay people are now asking their clergy about these things and discovering their clergy don't know much about these things and either never picked it up in seminary or let it go because it didn't seem very useful. And clergy are starting to feel some pressure to become more informed about these things. There is, I am convinced, a massive deliteralization of Christianity going on within the mainline church. And I think it is irreversible. It's quite possible that it may cause even institutional division in one or more of the major denominations, but I think it's irreversible. And it includes not only an interest in the history that lies behind the text, but also an openness to metaphor and symbol and metaphorical narrative, to a way of hearing the Bible again that can make it a source of insight and nourishment, rather than the Bible being an obstacle to the gospel, as Peter Gomes suggested in a lecture title of his. Has the Bible become an obstacle to the proclamation of the gospel? And obviously his passionate concern is that it not be that, but it has become that for many people. To come at this point one more time, I grew up as a semi-literalist. I know a lot of good Christians who are still literalists. The issue is not literalism or non-literalism, really. The issue is, what do you do when literalism becomes an obstacle to taking this seriously? What do we say to people who can't be literalists anymore? And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but maybe you can use some of these lines. What do we say to people who can't be literalists anymore? Do we say, sorry, only literalists can be Christians? Do we say, sorry, God accepts only literalists? That would be very weird, by the way. And back to my affirmation. The historical, and I would add metaphorical, the historical, metaphorical approach to the study of the Bible is providing a way for millions of people to become more wholeheartedly involved in their own Christian journey. And all of this, it seems to me, leads to a relational understanding of the Christian life rather than a believing understanding. And I would summarize that very compactly with three brief statements. The vision of life that we see in Jesus, if we take him seriously as a model for the path and for discipleship, it's a life that is first radically centered in God, radically centered in the Spirit. And secondly, the way or path of Jesus is that path of dying to an old way of being and being born into a new way of being that is the same as life in the Spirit. And thirdly, the effect of all of that, the fruit of all of that, is a passion for compassion and justice in the world. Thank you very much. Well, as we move into the question-response time, we have about 15 minutes. I'm going to suggest we take 30 seconds in silence to think about what you might want to comment about or ask about. It can be a comment that invites a response, but if it is, I encourage to keep your comments relatively brief. And I think if you're, well, at least if you're in the front half of the chapel here, I'm quite confident I can hear you well enough to crystallize the question so that everybody knows what I'm responding to before I respond. And I also think I will go for gender balance here and go boy, girl, or girl, boy, however that starts off. So let's take 30 seconds of silence to just think about what you might want to ask about and talk about, and I'll tell you when that time is up. Okay, before I look up or anybody puts a hand up, I didn't mean to exclude those of you in the back half of the chapel. If you think you've got a strong voice so I could hear you, by all means, feel free to stick a hand up as well. So who would like to get us started with a question or a comment? Yes, back on the aisle.
So I said, Jesus, my Lord and Savior. And the question I'm going to ask you is, you remember the Jesus seminar, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what percent wrote, did you say y'all voted, you said, he said this or he didn't say that. Roughly what percent of the Bible do you believe is true?
Well, on one level, no, I won't be quite this cute, but the question is, what percent of the Bible would I say is true? Let me come at it this way, and I'm not trying to be a weasel here or anything like that. For me, the difference between the true and, I don't even know if I'd use the language of untrue, but let me use it here for shorthand reasons. The difference between the true and untrue parts of the Bible would not be the same as the difference between the historical and non-historical. For example, I think the Genesis stories of creation are true, but I don't think for a moment the earth was created in 6 days, or 6 geological epochs that have that same sequence, and I don't for a moment believe there was a real Garden of Eden with a real Adam and Eve in them and so forth. But I think those stories are profoundly true as metaphorical narratives. I think the story of Jesus walking on the water didn't happen historically. I could be wrong about that, but that's where I come out as a historian. But I think the story is profoundly true, and it means something like, and here I borrow from John Dominic Crossan, it means something like, if you try to travel without Jesus, you sink. I think that's true. Okay? So for me, the question of true and untrue isn't the same as the question between historically factual and non-historical. And thus I could, in a slipshod kind of way, say I think all of the Bible is true. But that would make me uncomfortable because I think there are some parts of the Bible that never were true. I think, for example, the stories of and I won't go on too long about this, but the stories which portray God ordering the Israelites to kill all the men, women, and children of the Canaanites, I don't think that was ever the will of God. I think that's the way ancient Israel told their story. I could use some New Testament examples too. It's not just that there are things like that in the Hebrew Bible. So maybe that's a wishy-washy answer, but it's about as precise as I can get without getting out my pocket calculator, I think. So I'm going to content myself with that for that question. Woman's question or comment? Yes, please.
I have just finished reading your book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. And so your question, when you were talking about Luke, and he was saying, well, he felt like that you're all studying his guidance. My gut feeling was we would miss the compassion of Jesus, which is one of the most wonderful chapters in the book, I think.
Okay, I appreciate the comment very much. It's a statement that she's just finished reading my book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, and that without the historical study of Jesus, we might miss the centrality of compassion in Jesus' life. I think it's possible to see that, of course, without the historical approach. That is, before the 17th and 18th century, when modern scholarship and modern historical study was born, there were many Christians over a period of many centuries who got the point about compassion. But I still think it's illuminating to realize that, for example, those passages where Jesus is said to have spoken about casting people into the outer darkness where they will weep and wail and gnash their teeth, casting people into the furnace of fire. All of those highly judgmental passages are basically Matthean editorial additions to an earlier layer of the tradition, probably do not go back to Jesus. So I think the historical study of Jesus does enable us more easily to see the centrality of compassion and this passion for social justice in the life of Jesus, rather than it being about heaven and hell and the threats of eternal punishment and so forth, which begins to creep into the later portions of the New Testament. Okay? Yes, please.
I think you may be right in talking about the irreversible deliteralization going on in what you're calling the mainline churches. But I think that part of the sociological cost of that happens to be that the mainline churches are hardly the main line. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the fact that what we used to call the mainline churches seem no longer to be
Right.
the primary
Right.
place where church life is being lived in the United States.
Okay. The question begins with a comment that I may be right that this deliteralization that is going on is irreversible, but hasn't it also been accompanied by a decline in the membership of mainline denominations, so that in some sense they're no longer mainline if we're talking about majority of the population? You're absolutely right, of course, that mainline denominations, as most of us would be aware of, have declined significantly over the last 30 years, precipitously for a while. They've now leveled out since roughly 1992 or 1993. And some Christians would say that the reason the main line has declined is because it's become soft on doctrine or soft on the authority of Scripture or whatever. My own reading of the reason for the decline is quite different. I would mention two reasons very quickly. One is, I think that a significant number, I don't mean a majority, but a significant number of mainline clergy in my age cohort and maybe 20 years before and maybe a little bit afterwards became skeptical about the reality of God, or became uncertain about the reality of God. The death of God theology of the late 60s, it wasn't just an eccentric little movement, it expressed something of the ethos of the time. And I think as a result that some mainline congregations, when you go to them, you go there and it's hard to tell if anybody who put the service together thinks there's really anything to this. And one study of mainline congregations that are doing well found that what they all have in common is a vivid sense of the reality of God, and this leads the authors to conclude churches that are full of God will find their pews full of people. And I think conservative churches, by and large, have done a much better job of giving the impression that God is real and we take God seriously and so forth. I think that's one reason for mainline decline, that uncertainty. Second reason is because, I want to make sure I don't take too long to develop this. I grew up in a time and a place where it was still taken for granted that everybody would belong to a religious community. And in my part of that world, that meant a church. There was a cultural expectation in most parts of this country until 30, 40 years ago that everybody would belong to something. Sometime around 1965, according to demographers, that cultural expectation disappeared, so that people born after 1965 in this country, might be different in the South, grew up in a world where there wasn't a cultural expectation that you would belong to a church. Now, so long as there was a cultural expectation that you would be something, mainline denominations did very well because they provided a respectable and completely safe way of being Christian. Nobody would ask you to do anything too weird if you were a member of a mainline denomination. Once that expectation disappeared, one of the major reasons for people becoming part of a mainline church, it disappeared with it. And suddenly the only people left in mainline churches are either people who grew up with that cultural expectation and never got over it, or they are people who are intentional about being there. And we're only about 20 years away from the time when the only people left in mainline denominations will be people who are intentional about being there. They'll never be as big as they used to be, but they might be more interesting. Yeah. Time for one more, I think. The woman over here in front. Yeah.
Personal question.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that you began your search for the historical Jesus in about your early adulthood,
Yeah.
in your educational process. And having seen the Peter Jennings special, I was interested, did you approach it from that fact-finding point of view? How did you begin your historical Jesus at that point in time?
Yeah. The question is prefaced by the remark that it's somewhat of a personal one. She understands I began my own search for the historical Jesus when I was in my early 20s as part of my education. At that point, was it part of looking for the facts and so forth and so forth? Yes. Yes, it was.
Very much like he just dissented it very clearly. You know, did you go after this?
Yeah.
Logical or
Yeah. I was a product, I was a bright kid, interested in science. The modern worldview became like a steel trap in my head. If it couldn't be verified, it wasn't, probably wasn't true. What was true was empirical facts. And all of that drove my first 8 or 10 years of graduate study of the New Testament and the Bible and so forth. And so what I became most interested in was the political, because that really didn't depend upon the reality of God. You could take the prophets and justice seriously. You could take Jesus and justice seriously, even if you weren't sure about God. So I was a fact fundamentalist from probably about age 15 until my early 30s. And this is true of many of my generation and maybe beyond my generation, I don't know. And then in my early 30s, I had a series of absolutely unexpected experiences of the sacred that completely transformed my understanding of what the word God meant. Rather than God being a word we use for a being out there who may or may not exist, and faith being believing in this God who might or might not be there, suddenly I realized that the word God refers to a reality that is all around us and that is manifestly real, so that in my own mind I'm less real than God now. Not because I argued myself to that, but because of experiences of this non-material layer or level of reality. And those experiences foundationally transformed how I heard pretty important parts of the Bible. Like stories of visions. It's not that I think all visions now really happened. Some of them are literary creations, but I think visions do happen. I think, it sounds just so almost sophomoric to say this. I think the Spirit is real. I think the Spirit can be experienced. I think this is what the mystics of all traditions have always known. And so for me, once God became undoubtedly real, I could suddenly start seeing Jesus and Amos and Moses and so forth as people who were intoxicated by their experience of God, and that's where their passion and their insight and so forth came from. Well, we're about 2 minutes over. I am anal retentive about time. I want to thank all of you for showing up tonight. I want to reiterate the invitation to the reception, and I hope to see all of you, or a good number of you, tomorrow morning when I talk about the legacy of Albert Schweitzer for Jesus research. And I think it'll be interesting. Anyway, good night for now.